This is Dr. Steve Hewlett and from balancedfitlifestyles.com, and this is just going to be a follow-up video from ones we had before. And earlier we were talking about diabetes, and we were talking about how diabetes really wasn't a huge player in the United States before 1958. And we talked about how, according to the CDC guidelines, we only had about 1%, or about 500,000 people in the United States that had diabetes at that time. And now in not now, but back in 2015, that number had risen from 500,000 up to over 30 million people with diabetes. So this made me look at what happened in 1958. Why did things change around that time? And I found out that there was a whole series of extremely unfortunate events that occurred that led us to this devastation of type 2 diabetes, this horrible rates that we have going on right now. And basically what happened is, back in 1955, Eisenhower had a heart attack. And back before this time, heart attacks really weren't that common of a thing. So this led a bunch of people out to try to figure out what causes heart attacks. Well, when they did this kind of brought up two big players. This brought up one man by the name of John Yudkin. And John Yudkin was he was a British nutritionist and physiologist, and he said that the reason he did some research and found out that what he thought it was because of sugar. And so he went and he started telling everybody how sugar was horrible, damaging to your body. And this led to, up in 1972, he actually wrote a book called Pure, White, and Deadly, which was a fantastic book, and I really highly recommend John Yudkin's Pure, White, and Deadly. Now the other one was Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys, he was a Minnesota epidemiologist, and what Ancel Keys did was, and he was also the one who invented K rations for World War II. Well, Ancel Keys, he took a sabbatical and he went over to England in around 1952, and he came back and he came up with the conclusion that he thought that dietary fat and dietary cholesterol is what caused cardiovascular disease. And he put on this big study. It's called the 7-country study, which incidentally was a 22-country study, but he only found 7 countries that actually fit his model. And since then, and what this model said was, like I said, he said that it was dietary fat and dietary cholesterol that causes cardiovascular disease, which was wrong. And there were a ton of flaws with this 22-country study, or what was later called the 7-country study. And there's so many flaws. One of them was he didn't include any of the Inuit, which is these are the indigenous people of the Arctic, the northern Canada and Greenland. Some people call them Eskimos, but these people, they had a high intake. Most of their dietary intake came from animal fat and from animal meat, and they had one of the lowest cardiovascular disease rates in anywhere in the world. And the other thing that it didn't take into account was the fact that when he was doing his studies, he'd forgotten that this was also the advent of all the trans fats. This was when margarine was making its big debut with all the trans fats, which now we know how horrible trans fats are. But anyway, there were several flaws with this study. And the reason why this is so important is because back in 1973, President Nixon wanted to take food off the platform. He wanted to make sure that the price of food wasn't going to be a problem as far as an election. So he went and he tasked his Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Rusty Butz, and told him that he needed to make food just as cheap as he possibly could. Well, this is extremely important because right around the same time in the early 60s, there's also a man over in Japan who just came up with high fructose corn syrup. And this was extremely important because before this time, all of our sugar came from either cane sugar or beet sugar. And cane sugar and beet sugar were fairly expensive, and the prices went up and down and up and down, and they wanted to levelize that. They wanted to level it. And this is when they decided, we can use high fructose corn syrup instead of this cane sugar and beet sugar, and that'll bring the prices way down in our food. So that was one thing that happened. And this leads us to 1977. And this was when Senator McGovern was tasked with coming up with the National Dietary Guidelines for the United States. And this was so important because the person that he put in charge of this had no scientific background whatsoever. All he did was, through a series of events, went back to Ancel Keys' study that said that fat and dietary cholesterol is what caused cardiovascular disease. And this was huge because without any scientific background whatsoever, no more studies, this was automatically endorsed by the American Heart Association, the United States Department of Agriculture, and the American Society of Clinical Nutrition. And this became basically law. And what they did after this was they went back to all the food manufacturers and said, now you're going to have to retool. What we want you to do is come up with 5 things. We want you to be able to make as much food as you possibly can to take care of our growing population. They also want to make it cheap as possible so it can be very affordable for everyone. They also needed to be able to stay on the shelves for longer periods of time so they could be in a grocery store. They also needed to be able to be frozen so it could be transported across the United States. And because of Ancel Keys' flawed study, they also had to take out all the good fat, either take it out or reduce it. And that's exactly what the drug manufacturers did. They went and they took out all the good, healthy animal fats, and they replaced it with all the extremely toxic seed oils, vegetable oils, and trans fats. But this allowed it to stay on the shelves for a longer period of time. The other thing they did was they had to take out all the fiber, because this allowed it to be frozen so it could be transported across the country. But now when they took out all the fat and they took out all the fiber, that also took out all the flavor. So what did they do to increase the flavor? They went and they put in high fructose corn syrup because it was cheap and it was sweet and it wasn't fat. And this was the advent of high processed food. And this of the high processed food, that's when our diabetes rates started skyrocketing, which leads to more problems that we'll be talking about in future videos. So I hope this wasn't too boring. I just want to give you a little brief understanding of what was going on, and hope to see you in our next videos.